White pawn marches to d4. Black knight marches to f6. White pawn marches to c4. Black pawn marches to e6. White knight marches to f3. Black pawn marches to b6. White pawn marches to g3. Black bishop marches to b7. White bishop marches to g2. Black bishop marches to e7. White kingside castling. Black kingside castling. White rook moves sideways to e1. Black knight marches to a6. White knight marches to c3. Black pawn marches to d5. White pawn captures pawn at d5. Black pawn captures pawn at d5. White bishop marches to f4. Black rook moves sideways to e8. White rook moves sideways to c1. Black pawn marches to c5. White pawn captures pawn at c5. Black knight captures pawn at c5. White knight marches to d4. Black pawn marches to a6. White pawn marches to a3. Black bishop retreats to f8. White pawn marches to b4. Black knight retreats to e6. White knight captures knight at e6. Black pawn captures knight at e6. White knight marches to a4. Black rook moves sideways to c8. White rook captures rook at c8. Black queen captures rook at c8. White queen marches to d4. Black pawn marches to b5. White rook moves sideways to c1. Black queen moves sideways to d8. White knight marches to c5. Black bishop captures knight at c5. White queen captures bishop at c5. Black queen marches to d7. White queen marches to b6. Black rook moves sideways to c8. White rook captures rook at c8 and gives check. Black bishop captures rook at c8 and breaks check. White bishop marches to h3. Black king marches to f7. White bishop marches to e5. Black queen moves sideways to e7. White queen moves sideways to c6. Black queen moves sideways to d7. White queen retreats to c3. Black bishop marches to b7. White pawn marches to f3. Black knight retreats to e8. White queen moves sideways to d3. Black king retreats to g8. White queen moves sideways to e3. Black bishop retreats to c8. White queen marches to c5. Black knight marches to f6. White king marches to f2. Black king marches to f7. White king marches to e3. Black queen moves sideways to b7. White queen retreats to c3. Black bishop marches to d7. White king retreats to f2. Black queen marches to b6 and gives check. White bishop escapes check at d4. Black queen moves sideways to d6. White queen moves sideways to e3. Black pawn marches to h6. White bishop marches to e5. Black queen moves sideways to c6. White queen marches to a7. Black knight retreats to e8. White queen marches to b8. Black queen retreats to c8. White queen captures queen at c8. Black bishop captures queen at c8. White king marches to e3. Black knight marches to f6. White king marches to d4. Black knight retreats to d7. White bishop marches to c7. Black bishop marches to b7. White pawn marches to e3. Black king moves sideways to e7. White bishop retreats to f1. Black knight marches to f6. White pawn marches to g4. Black pawn marches to h5. White pawn marches to g5. Black knight retreats to d7. White bishop marches to d3. Black king moves sideways to f7. White pawn marches to h4. Black pawn marches to g6. White bishop retreats to d6. Black bishop marches to c6. White pawn marches to f4. Black bishop retreats to b7. White bishop retreats to c2. Black knight marches to b6. White king marches to c5. Black knight retreats to d7 and gives check. White king escapes check at d4. Black knight marches to b6. White bishop marches to d3. Black knight retreats to d7. Threefold repetition. Black bishop marches to c6. White bishop retreats to c2. Black king moves sideways to g7. White bishop retreats to d1. Black king moves sideways to f7. White bishop marches to e2. Black king moves sideways to g7. White bishop marches to f3. Black king moves sideways to f7. White pawn marches to f5. Black pawn captures pawn at f5. White bishop captures pawn at d5 and gives check. Black bishop captures bishop at d5 and breaks check. White king captures bishop at d5. Black king moves sideways to e7. White king marches to c6. Black king marches to e6. White bishop retreats to f4. Black knight marches to e5 and gives check. White king escapes check at b6. Black knight marches to c4 and gives check. White king captures pawn at a6 and breaks check. Black knight captures pawn at a3. White king moves sideways to b6. Black king marches to d5. White king marches to c7. Black king marches to e4. White king retreats to c6. Black knight retreats to c4. White king captures pawn at b5. Black knight captures pawn at e3. White bishop captures knight at e3. Black king captures bishop at e3. White king moves sideways to c5. Black pawn marches to f4. White pawn marches to b5. Black pawn marches to f3. White pawn marches to b6. Black pawn marches to f2. White pawn marches to b7. Black pawn marches to f1 and promotes to queen. White pawn marches to b8 and promotes to queen. Black queen retreats to f5 and gives check. White king escapes check at c6. Black king moves sideways to f3. White queen retreats to b4. Black king moves sideways to g3. White king moves sideways to d6. Black queen retreats to f8 and gives check. White resigns and black wins the game.